Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kurt de Ketelaar. I'm the Secretary General of the League of European Research Universities. Welcome at this LERU event on science diplomacy and universities. You all know, I don't have to say that we are living in very exciting but difficult times. The geopolitical situation is at this moment in time quite complicated and quite worrying. We see all kinds of conflicts worldwide, which certainly lead us to realizing that the need for diplomacy in this very difficult world is an absolute necessity. We all can only hope that the professional diplomats which are present worldwide at national level, at European level, at international level, that they all can do their job as best as possible. And obviously, in that context of diplomacy also comes the question, what about science diplomacy? What can universities, what can academics do in this very difficult time, and how can they contribute to potentially solving conflicts which are existing in all kinds of regions and all kinds of places on this globe. And if we talk about universities, then of course we think about their three essential roles that universities have in this world, namely making sure that people are educated, making sure that we can do the necessary research on all kinds of topics, but also through what we call the third mission of universities, our societal engagement, our societal commitment and service as academics to this society. And these issues, how universities can contribute to science diplomacy and to solving all kinds of conflicts and issues worldwide, has been the subject of a fantastic report that was published by the European Commission earlier this year in February 2025, with the title that you all will have seen, A European Framework for Science Diplomacy. And this report is the outcome of a year-long set of meetings, collaborations, reflections between a big group of people who met in different working groups and in different locations during 2024. And they have come up then finally in this report with a set of recommendations dealing with multiple aspects of science diplomacy. And I'm very glad that we have this afternoon for this LERU event on science diplomacy and universities, that we have one of the lead authors and one of the group leaders of this report that was presented earlier this year, Jean-Christophe Mauduit, who is Associate Professor of Science Diplomacy at University College London, and who has been heavily involved in the drafting of this report. He will present to us this afternoon the main, well, he will start off, of course, with situating the report, but then primarily focus on the recommendations which are dealing with universities and how we can contribute in this debate on science diplomacy and conflict resolution worldwide. Jean-Christophe has a PhD in astrophysics, but also an MA in law and diplomacy, and he has for a while followed both tracks in his professional activities, but I think that primarily today he's focusing almost exclusively on science diplomacy. Before he joined UCL, he was at the American Association for the Advancement of Science in DC, in Washington, DC. He also has been the Associate Director of the Science Diplomacy Center at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Boston. And of course, before that, you also had a number of activities and professional engagements in France and beyond. So a very experienced, very specialized colleague dealing with this topic. We had the pleasure to have him before already in several LERU activities. So I'm very sure that we are in for a excellent presentation on the topic. Jean-Christophe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kurt, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen and confirm that you can see my screen as well. Great. So thank you to LERU for really the kind invitation to speak to you today before the panel, which I really greatly look forward to. I believe that this is exactly the type of discussions mixing different stakeholders with different perspectives on the world that we need to start having to get to the answers of today's question, which is what role for universities in science diplomacy? Um, I'd like to also thank UCL, who is part of LERU, for giving me the opportunity to actually work on science diplomacy from a university. I want to stress here that my research is not focusing on the role of universities in that realm, but I'm speaking from the position of being embedded with a university setting, teaching, researching science diplomacy, and engaging with many national and international institutions in that realm. So I think everybody here would be convinced of this, but it's worth saying, as Kurt mentioned, that in today's world, science and science technology and innovation are playing an increasingly important role in international relations and has repercussions on economic growth, economic security, military security, and is increasingly linked to many geopolitical aspects. So just to paint a broad picture, universities have a role in the national policy settings of their host nations. So that's on science policy, particularly the known taxonomy of science for policy on the left side, which is the use of knowledge to facilitate or improve policymaking at the national level. The revert is policy for science, meaning the government setting the direction for science in the country. So there's the national realm, national policies, in which universities have a role to play, even if it's still needs improvement in the way that this is done at the national level. And then on the right side, it's really entering the domain of foreign policies or international policies, and which we refer to as science diplomacy. And mirroring the science policy taxonomy is the well-known three-pronged approach of science diplomacy launched by AAAS and the Royal Society in 2010. The framework has many limitations that have been pointed out over the years. Nonetheless, it's good to present it here today for context. So, of course, diplomacy for science, which is the diplomacy that helps in enabling international scientific collaboration. The reverse would be the science for diplomacy, the scientific cooperation that actually has an influence on international relations, as well as the dimension of science in diplomacy, where science provides advice to inform and support foreign policy objectives. On this framework, I want just to maybe caution on the word "for" that is used in the framework because it has a positive connotation, but there are uses of science diplomacy that have negative, let's say, effects on global science, but they may have an effect on foreign policy that is the sought effect by the actor that's wielding it. So, for example, research security or the use of scientific sanctions to certain foreign policy goals is part of science diplomacy. And not only states do that, but it's also universities doing it, deciding not to collaborate or to collaborate with certain actors. So just to move with the question, can universities be science diplomacy actors? I think conventionally or traditionally, diplomacy has been construed as the practice by which states represent themselves and their interests to one another. But in this world moving to a global governance framework, it's been noted by scholars and practitioners that we're moving away from the state-based institution only in diplomacy towards a system where within a nation state you have many different actors that contribute to that national diplomatic system and influence in a way the foreign policy of that state. So you see here in the second line the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and universities together in the same diplomatic system. But then we're moving further in a world where many different actors, states, universities, NGOs, private sectors, and so on, actually have strong inputs diplomatically in the international sphere. So this is no longer, diplomacy is no longer the exclusive domain of sovereign states, even if they remain the building blocks, of course, of the international system. So there's many actors in science diplomacy, each with a role to play. On the left, you've got a graph from the European Science Diplomacy Framework that was released in 25. And you see on the left side, universities being, of course, recognized as part of that system. Maybe a word about universities. In that system, they are hybrid actors, or that's the way that I would construe it, because they're nationally situated but internationally minded. So they both play a national and a transnational role. Sometimes the role is passive. So, for example, a university is an inherent part of the state's self-power, the state in which they reside. And they can take an active part. So they can, help the state with their science diplomacy, and they can also build their own collaborations and diplomatic activities themselves. And sometimes these actions can be aligned with their host states, sometimes they may not. So it's a difficult sort of hybridity to navigate. And I think an extra level of complexity is the different dimensions when we speak about universities. There's a whole host of actors within universities that may each have their activities that can be aligned or not. So are we talking about single researchers that are embedded at universities? Are we talking about departments? Are we talking about the university leadership, for example, or even university alliances or consortia? So I think we have to be mindful of all this complexity when we talk about universities. I want to say a word also about universities being themselves embedded within greater alliances. So you have an example here of the European Union Science Diplomacy Alliance, which is a mix of universities, research institutes, think tanks, support organizations, and civil societies throughout the EU that have an interest in science diplomacy and working together with policy briefs, with actors, and so on. So that introduces also a form of hybridity that is very interesting to consider. So I want to say that we see a strengthening of science diplomacy globally with many actors. So on the left side, you can see that the EU has been moving quite a lot lately, with ministers discussing the importance of science diplomacy and the Horizon Europe program, for example, as a tool. But you see also in the G20 science advisors meeting internationally and discussing international policy and scientific advice. You see it in international organizations with the UN, for example, reinstating a science advisory board looking at science advice on breakthroughs in science and technology, again, the disruptive nature that we're dealing with. And UNESCO just this year convened a global ministerial dialogue on science diplomacy. You also see non-state actors like the International Science Council moving forward and putting out a strategy on advancing their own science diplomacy strategies. So you see a lot of actors moving forward and embracing science diplomacy. And as Kurt said, in February 2025, and I'm sure Jan Marco Müller on the panel later on will talk in depth about it, a year-long process led to 120 experts to put forward a European framework for science diplomacy, which is the document on the left, and recommending 9 big recommendations. I'm not going to delve into them so much. I'm going to focus on the enabling instruments here because they pertain a lot to universities. Enabling instruments really aim to support the science diplomacy ecosystem in the EU, and they help promote and facilitate science diplomacy activities. And unsurprisingly, that is indeed where universities have been mostly called on to. So I'm going to talk more about their missions, as Kurt said, of education, research, and societal and international engagement as it relates to these recommendations. So the first obvious mission, of course, of universities is training and education. And in science diplomacy, education and training is ramping up. It is by far not prevalent, and in the EU it's growing, but it's still not there. But the importance here of training, and when I'm saying training, is training current professionals, so training scientists, current scientists and diplomats that typically live in silos. I'm schematizing, but often it is the case. And training to bridge the gap that we see in the current silos between scientists and diplomats. So it's training early career researchers to understand the world of diplomacy, having them visit here on the left the UN system. So you'll hear from JSPI and UCL's partnership and bringing scientists to the Geneva UN institutions, or training the other side, diplomats. So you see here diplomats in the UAE being trained in science diplomacy, or diplomats, French and British diplomats visiting UCL and being acquainted with the scientific research that's going on. On the other side, it's also education towards the future, educating the future generation of professionals that are blended, meaning that they're no longer siloed, but actually the track both teaches science and international relations and diplomacy. And you see a lot of classes. This is an example of my science diplomacy class here, for example. But in certain parts of the world, particularly in Malaysia, we've seen even a master's level program being designed and launched. Also at the doctoral level, of course, it's about furthering training for PhD level scientists, and that is being done, for example, at Politecnico di Milano in Italy. And on the right side, you see also PhD students actually researching and being educating in science diplomacy topics. So in terms of the future and what the framework he's seeking in terms of training and education from a university standpoint, I'm not going to delve into the actions here, but basically on the right side, as summarized, there is clearly a need to develop further training and education offers in the EU and EU universities. There's also a need for homogeneity across those training and educational offers, and to try to develop a more comprehensive competency framework, and to make sure that the outcome of these training and education pipelines is really geared towards what is needed in terms of science diplomacy knowledge and skills for professionals and the future generation. So a brief word on research. One of the core missions of universities, especially in the LERU group. There is departments of public policy or science policy, more traditionally centered on the national interface, that are now increasingly doing research on science diplomacy. You can see an example of India, where there is the Indian Institute of Science, ISC, a center for policy research that is focusing on also science diplomacy, that indeed then advises the government or helps the government in deploying foreign policy and science. The example here in the UK is my own department, a science policy department, that increasingly also does research in science diplomacy. There are many other examples, but I just wanted to point some of those out. Of course, there are researchers looking at history, STS, and other kinds of departments that are increasingly working on this. The research in science diplomacy addresses national, regional, and global challenges that we see emerging in SNT. It can be cross-cutting across all these challenges on structures, institutions, processes, human capacity, and so on, or thematic in terms of different tracks of science. Examples here from my own research looking at science advice in multilateral settings or in negotiations, how it is used, how it is done. or how human capacity can be deployed overseas, and the strategies at the national level, and how that trickles down all the way to science counselors and attachés in embassy, for example. So very different sort of research, but that is needed in science diplomacy, as surprisingly, there's not a lot that we know about all of this. I want to highlight also on the right side that there was in the EU, there were three main research projects that were funded by the EU on science diplomacy that has launched this whole sort of science diplomacy research initiatives in the EU. But the last one ended in 2022, and since then we haven't seen any further funding coming. So this is something that would be the future of hopefully in the EU, is to further develop that research. So advancing the frontiers of science diplomacy through research and innovative approaches to really strengthen EU research in science diplomacy, potentially through Horizon Europe calls, and strengthen science diplomacy collaborations between universities in the EU, and of course also beyond in third countries and regions. So finally, the third dimension that Kurt mentioned is the role of universities in international impact and science diplomacy in practice, or in action, if you will. So often we see researchers as and universities as providers of science advice to national and international institutions. So here an example in the UK, Professor Sir Robin Grimes, who is at Imperial College, but was also the science advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the UK. My own work in the middle, where we used research and convened stakeholders from the Portuguese government and their embassies in the UK to look at the way that science advice is provided to the ambassador and the embassy at large. And of course, in my department and other places in universities, you have colleagues that are contributing to international institutions like the IPCC and other such international scientific endeavors. If you think about science for diplomacy, universities can also be conveners of dialogues and brokers, offering neutral locations to have meetings. So on the right side, you see a meeting that was organized of all the science advisors to ministries of foreign affairs. And if you squint in the picture, you might see myself and also Jan Michael Müller. That was back in 2017 at a university campus. But also on the left side, universities can be conduits for track 2 discussions in tense geopolitical situations. So this is a picture of a colleague of mine, Professor James Hammond, working in North Korea on a volcano at the border of China and North Korea. And his work has been instrumental also in getting these sort of track 2 informal discussions going, and talking about working under sanctions and intense geopolitical situations. And finally, there's the dimension of diplomacy for science, where obviously universities are enablers of international science collaborations, enablers of academic mobility as well, and academic freedom. And of course, they are advocates for the scientific community at large. So a few examples here of organizations that involve universities, both on the scholar refugee side and on the diaspora side. Just a last word about universities. I think their role is growing in terms of being transnational actors and being diplomatic bridges. So you see campuses of universities here, US University in Rwanda, in the middle, Sorbonne's University campus in the UAE, University of Tokyo, being in partnerships and campuses in China and Korea through the Campus Asia program. So really reinforcing these links between countries. And you see also increasingly university alliances across the EU and worldwide, really increasing their reflections around science diplomacy and putting forward strategies in terms of how they want to engage. So you see here a picture of the Francophone University Association, also LERU engaging with European Union policymakers, as well as others putting out policy briefs in terms of their strategy in science diplomacy. So in terms of the future, there was a recommendation in the framework on creating and connecting science diplomacy communities in Europe and beyond. And that's from the need to strengthen these communities and to ensure that scholars and practitioners also meet and talk informally and formally as well about science diplomacy issues. And then the last recommendation was also to make sure that they leverage the scientific diasporas, whether they are diasporas that come to the EU from third-party countries like refugee scholars and so on, but also the outward flow of EU scientific diasporas elsewhere outside the EU. So in my last two slides, I just want to say that we see increasingly tensions between cooperation and competition emerge in the realm of science diplomacy. As we said earlier, of course, STI is feeding in growth, economic growth, and hence competitiveness. It has repercussions in economic and military security. We see increasingly disruptive technologies becoming geopolitical currencies, and we see a hardening of politics and geopolitics that creates more tension in the realm of science diplomacy. So it's this careful balance of cooperation and competition that we see in science diplomacy. So in a nutshell here, maybe hopefully our panel and our panelists will be able to say or start answering some of these questions. But in terms of capacity, the question is how can universities further participate to building up this science diplomacy capacity in the EU through research and education endeavors? In terms of their engagement, how can they further engage to counterbalance this hardening in geopolitics and be advocates for global science? And I think very importantly is reflecting on values and what universities' perspectives can bring in terms of engaging with their national and EU institutions in defining what values these actors may, the values that would underpin the science diplomacy agenda of these actors. So I think those are going to be very important discussions to have in the future between universities and these various actors. So I'll stop here and thank you for your attention, and I greatly look forward to the panel. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean-Christophe, for this excellent contribution to the event and summarizing the recommendations put forward by the report of the European Commission. It's clear that there is still quite some work to be done by universities in this field as well, with regard to the education offer that we have on this important topic. Secondly, also, as you indicated, it's a bit disappointing, in fact, after all those years, that the amount of research going on the topic is still so limited. But it's good to see, I would say, with regard to the third role that we can play, that nonetheless, a lot of our colleagues in academia are prepared to take up specific roles in specific fora and gremia to contribute already to the discussion between academics and diplomats, which is at the end of the day the goal that we have to realize, making sure that those silos, as you said, that they are broken down and that people on as well the diplomatic side as on the academic side are starting to work together much more and much more intensively. So thank you once again. So dear viewers, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest that we move to the second part of our event this afternoon. And our second part is, Jean-Christophe already indicated, a panel debate where we have invited a number of key people which are active and specialized also on this topic. My colleague, Dr. Katrien Maas, is going to introduce the panel in a minute. I just want to indicate that after the panel debate, we will have time for Q&A with all of you. And so I would say if you have specific questions, be it for Jean-Christophe, be it for the panel members, just put them in the Q&A And then we will, depending on the amount of questions in the Q&A, of course, we will try to make a selection and submit them through Katrien to the different panel members. I see that there was already one question from my dear friend, Dimitri Korpakis. I hope that Dimitri is doing well, and we will come back to that question or a number of other questions later in this event. But let me first hand over now to Katrien for introducing the panel and for dealing with the different topics that I would like to submit to the panel. Katrien, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. Hello, everyone. Indeed, I'm Katrien, and I have with me here an amazing group of people in our panel. They come from academia, from government. They have lots of expertise and experience. Let me briefly introduce you to them. I will just say their titles, but for more information and about what they've been doing elsewhere, please go to the webpage for this event and you can read in detail. So first of all, let me introduce Ms. Natasha Kos. She is the head of Department for Cultural and Scientific Diplomacy at the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs in the Republic of Slovenia. Next, we have Mr. Jan Marco Müller. He is the team leader, global approach for multilateral dialogue and science diplomacy at the Directorate General for Research and Innovation at the European Commission. And third, we have Mr. Nicolas Seidler. He is the Executive Director of the Geneva Science Policy Interface, the GPSI that we already heard about at the University of Geneva. And he's leading the platform's work there to enhance scientific engagement with global governance actors within the international Geneva ecosystem. And next to the University of Geneva, we also have Trinity College Dublin. Let me mention another LERU member next to UCL, of course. So last but not least, Dr. Sally Smith. She is Director of Research at Trinity College Dublin, where she is responsible for leading on research strategy, policy, and research support functions. So let's dive in. I want to mention that question that Kurt already mentioned by Dimitri Korpakis, because I think it is something which is on the front of our minds. We'll be discussing much more broadly than this, but still, his question is, can science diplomacy ease or even help to avert geopolitical tensions? I single it out now, even though we'll take the questions at the end of the panel, and do keep those questions coming. But I think it already sets the mood that we are in. But first of all, let me turn to Jan. We already heard about the recent report of the European Commission. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're hoping to achieve with this report, and specifically what it means for universities and how the EU and the universities can work together in a very practical way, beyond the recommendations also that you make in the report?
Thanks a lot, Katrien. And thanks to LERU for organizing this webinar. And also actually thank you to all the experts that have contributed to this report. And as I see many of them here in the audience, and great to have you here. I think we need to recognize that the world has become a quite hostile place in recent years. Hostile in terms of multilateralism, in terms of international cooperation, also hostile to science to a certain degree. So what we are seeing is science and technology and innovation being more and more used as a geopolitical currency. And that, of course, has to explain that we are kind of facing a perfect storm of, these geopolitical tensions, the groundbreaking developments, which we see especially in the area of digital technologies, but also biotechnologies and others. And of course, against the background of climate change and all these global challenges and crises that are not going to go away just because you don't like the evidence. So that's something we need to handle. And this, in a way, is the reason why science diplomacy has come also to the fore and has crept up on the political agenda. And as much as I like, of course, the report, for me, actually more important than the report itself is the way to get there. It was about really putting the scientists and the diplomats together into one room, talk to each other, understand each other, and develop solutions together. Because I think that's very important. And I think having participated to some of those discussions, I really enjoyed a lot those discussions, you know, when scientists and diplomats discuss the concept of like-mindedness and who's like-minded or not like-minded in this world, and what when you're like-minded in research policy but not like-minded in foreign policy, or when partners which you thought to be like-minded suddenly are not like-minded anymore. I think all these complex issues we are facing nowadays, and if you get to the kind of, not in a nutshell, to the key messages of this report, yes, of course, European science diplomacy is about our strategic, economic, political interests, and I think that's very normal. That's what any diplomacy in a way is about. But it is also about promoting our values. It is also about, you know, promoting peace, promoting multilateralism, and where I think the European Union can play an important role, but where we actually need to get our act together in Europe across member states. So I think it is really a call to all of us to work together, for scientists and diplomats, to both communities to work hand in hand. And I think universities really have a key role to play here. And let me just remind you of the European University Strategy, and I quote from the European University Strategy: universities are instrumental in building Europe's connections with the world and in promoting European values globally. They play a vital role in generating the evidence that underpins Europe's foreign and security policies, international agreements, and multilateral action. And as key players in science diplomacy, they help building bridges. So actually, also in the university strategy, actually, the science diplomacy is an important element. And certainly no coincidence that roughly a quarter of the experts that contributed to this report are actually working for universities or university associations. So they played a very important role here. So obviously, what is this role about? And I think there's, of course, this international cooperation element based on a universal language of science. And JC, he mentioned the example of James Hammond, a wonderful example, volcanologist working in North Korea. He probably knows North Korea better than most diplomats, and he's not a political scientist at all. He's a geoscientist. So he has, of course, very valuable knowledge to contribute. Of course, universities, they have a role actually in advancing the frontiers of science diplomacy in terms of research. They have a key role in educating the future professionals in science diplomacy. And finally, I think one important element which we shouldn't forget, actually, universities are science diplomacy actors in their own right. So when, for instance, Belgian universities decide to cut ties with Israeli entities, or lobby to end cooperation with Israel in research, that is hardcore science diplomacy. And I think that's something we need to be honest about. So science diplomacy is not just about being nice to each other. Yes, it is this soft power, and I think we all should go for it wherever possible to promote the soft power and promote cooperation. But it also has this kind of hard element of restrictions, of sanctions, of research security, of dual use, of all these issues that come into play here. And that's a reality I think we all need to deal with. And the best way to deal with it is by having honest discussions and cooperation between scientists and diplomats.
All right, thanks for that. Unless I see somebody raising their hands in the panel that you want to react to something immediately, no, we'll have some more time for that. But let me ask another question, Sally. Okay, you listened to what, for instance, Jan has said as an EU actor. You at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland, how do you engage within your university and externally to strengthen the role of science diplomacy? And can you give some practical examples of how that works within your university?
Yes, absolutely. And again, thank you very much, LERU, for organising this webinar. It's obviously a very important topic. So I guess I want to say initially that certainly a lot is done within Trinity that could be called science diplomacy, but is in fact not called that. And that is because that term is not yet deployed systematically internally. And I guess it's one of the benefits of reports like this and events like this, which is, you know, one of the benefits is to allow us to coalesce around a mutual understanding of what that term is. So I'll briefly go through about 3 areas where I think Trinity is really engaging in this area, but as I said, not really under that label. Firstly is evidence for policy or policy engagement work, which has been mentioned by previous speakers. And in terms of the typology, this would be the science in diplomacy bit, and relates to the recommendation around fostering the science for policy ecosystem. And I'll talk briefly about it specifically in the national context. So the Irish government sees this as very, very important, actually. So in the National Research and Innovation Policy, it is specifically identified as an important imperative. And in fact, within our department, our government department that deals with research and higher education, there is a specific evidence for policy unit. So this is clearly seen as really important nationally. And Trinity academics, as many other academics in the Irish system do a great deal in this regard. And it isn't just, you know, as has been alluded to before, this is very broad in terms of disciplinary spread. It is not just in sort of what could be called the technological area or the science area, and very much dovetails actually with very useful remarks in the framework, which is about the importance of science diplomacy for combating disinformation and strengthening democracy. So we are right there immediately talking about political science, legal scholarship, psychology, history, and others. So there's a great deal of that occurs within Trinity. But I would say it is not yet understood by us institutionally, I think, as systematically as it could be. So what we are doing actually right now is investing in resource centrally in the Dean of Research's office to get somebody in to help us understand our evidence for policy work more systematically, because I think that's very important. Notably, particularly in this regard, our Department for Foreign Affairs has a university engagement program. So it is really interested in how university-based researchers as thought leaders can assist with their policy and diplomatic work. And I'm not going to go on about this because it's my particular interest, but I think this is where research assessment reform really comes in. I am Ireland's co-chair of a COARA national chapter, and I do think it is really important that universities understand that this kind of work, as central it is to the science diplomacy agenda in general, make, as well as other agenda, do incentivize and properly reward this work on the part of researchers. So very, very quickly, secondly, another example I think of our work that's important is University of Sanctuary and Scholars at Risk work. These are programs for displaced students and scholars. And this speaks very much to that element of science diplomacy, which is about internationalization and cooperation, building and maintaining bridges between scholarly communities. And we recently have welcomed 8 postgraduate and 2 post-undergraduate scholars from Gaza. And thirdly, I want to briefly mention the science for diplomacy angle, which is using science cooperation to build relationships. And this has a particular place in Ireland. The government has, as a central initiative, something called the Shared Island Initiative, which is to enhance cooperation between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And I think very interestingly, as part of that initiative and as part of the funding associated with that initiative, there is a research program called the North-South Research Program associated with that, which is funding projects across all disciplines to deliver an all-island approach, is what it's called. So this is very clearly and explicitly, I suppose, seeing research cooperation as central to diplomatic ends. So yeah, just to end, we do a lot in Trinity that I think could be called that, but I do think, as the European Union Science Diplomacy Alliance calls, is that there are a proliferation of practices that are labelled this, and we need to be careful that it just doesn't become a catch-all phrase that lacks a bit of meaning. So I do think this idea of definitional precision that is talked about in the report is really important as a next step for us in universities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right. A lot of food for thought here, things that we could unpack. I don't see any immediate reactions from the panel, so we'll just go to the next person. Nicholas, I have a question for you. So the Geneva Science Policy Interface, you sit there in Geneva at the heart of where international relations happens in Europe towards the world. You're in a unique ecosystem there. How does that work? Can you share more about the rationale for why you set up a GSPI there, well, not there, but around the University of Geneva, of course, and the interactions that you have with the UN institutions and others, maybe.
Sure, thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thanks as well to LERU for the kind invitation. So yeah, Geneva Science Policy Interface, as the name implies, we're based in Geneva, and there's a reason for that, and that's that a substantial part of the UN system is based here in Geneva. There are about 38 international organizations here in this ecosystem that cover a wide range of global governance issues, from trade to human rights, migrations, global health, and there's a saying in the UN that Geneva is often called the kitchen of the UN, where the sort of groundwork of multilateral policies are being cooked in a way. A lot of the UN secretariats that are based in Geneva are actually producing a lot of evidence, a lot of reports that will inform diplomatic exchanges. While on the other hand, New York is the dining table, the more political arena where decisions are being taken. But again, a key ingredient of effective multilateralism is solid evidence, and there's a real practice, but also a need among UN organizations here in Geneva to work with academic institutions and to work with researchers. Now, the challenge around that, that in part led to the creation of the GSPI, is that, as you know, researchers, scientists, quite naturally, often lack knowledge of diplomatic processes, diplomatic actors, and the sort of relationship-building elements that revolve around that. And also, they have often little time, little recognition or funding for policy engagement, even though there are, again, a lot of positive developments across academia to promote that societal engagement part. That's still an arena where a lot of scientists feel that that's something they do in addition to academic research and potentially education as well. So that's the context that led the Swiss Foreign Affairs and the University of Geneva, along with several other academic institutions and network, including LERU, to 6 years ago say we need a new tool in the International Geneva Toolbox. We need sort of new specialized actors who work at the interface of science and diplomacy to, on the one hand, provide support and incentives for new science diplomacy collaborations by sort of having connections to both the academic side and the diplomacy side, and on the other hand, to contribute to professionalize this field of practice, and also to support capacities and competencies of actors willing to engage. And that relates to the training elements that have been described before. And so that's very much the mission of the GSPI. We're a small team of 5 people, really focused on mobilizing science around the knowledge needs of actors in the multilateral system that we find in Geneva. So to give you just an example, to date, we've supported with seed funding and also advice and support about 15 projects on a wide range of thematic areas in Geneva. Again, we are a transversal actor, so we've covered health, migrations, trade, and many other topics. And really across those collaborations, pushing for UN professionals and academics to co-pilot projects, to really work together, because we know from literature, but we've also seen in practice that the sort of collaboration, the co-creation projects really promote better uptake of policy, of research in policy. They promote deeper, much mutual understanding, and they also create sort of longer-term relationships. One example, we've, for example, supported a co-production process to create a policy brief on One Health, related to the recent pandemic. And really that process pushed to have regular consultations and exchanges between the researchers and several UN organizations that were relevant to that policy brief. And what's interesting is that some recommendations from that brief were sort of captured in a Swiss position on One Health, but beyond that, it's a process that led to further collaborations between the research leads and UN professionals. So, the process, again, is very beyond the piece of paper itself, is really very important in the work that we do. Another quick example, we also supported with the International Science Council a model for sort of a pilot science advice mechanism in disarmament as part of the Biological Weapons Convention. And that's a process through which we tested a model of interactions between scientific experts from around the world with a set of diplomats in Geneva to really see how could a more formal science policy mechanism within that international convention could look like. So really sort of testing a safe space around that. So yeah, I would just say that across the work that we've done, if there's one lesson learned, one observation that we've made, and that many others have, of course, is that ultimately the success of a science diplomacy or science policy project really is only about 20% a matter of data, knowledge, and evidence. It's, of course, very important to have good science, but it's about, success is really about 80% of relationships, relational competencies in crafting those projects. And that relational part is really at the core of successful science policy interfaces, at the core of the work that we do, and also relates to training activities that we are doing that I can also talk about more later.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you, Nicolas, from the kitchen there in Geneva. It's a very recognizable point, not only in science diplomacy, but something I hear LERU representatives say a lot. It's not just about individual projects. It's about the long term and the different type of relationships that get created in the process. So we'll come back a little bit more to the training later. But for now, I want to give Natasha the floor also. If you could speak, Natasha, to what this year, it's already not specifically 2025, but it seems certainly that we are in a different world, and that also has consequences for science diplomacy. Could you talk a little bit more about that and say what aspect of science diplomacy is important in your work? And please give some concrete examples if you can. We love those.
Yes, I will try to. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. It is a pleasure to join you and present how Slovenia is placing science diplomacy at the heart of our foreign policy efforts. As a young country, Slovenia is built on the values of the knowledge and the cooperation and innovation. Since gaining independence in 1991, we have seen science not as a luxury, but as a necessity for the strategic investment in our future, of course, in our global relevance, and of course, also our resilience in our society. That's why for us, science diplomacy is not just about the soft power, as it was already mentioned here, but it is about credibility, visibility, and also partnerships. And as you mentioned, long-term partnerships. Universities, I think, are at the heart of that story. And this is why we also established a dedicated sector of the science diplomacy within the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs, alongside the cultural diplomacy, to create also synergies and amplify Slovenia's presence as a country of knowledge, of innovation, of progress, and of course, collaboration. From our perspective at the ministry, the most crucial aspect of science diplomacy today is its ability to act as a bridge between research, innovation, foreign policy, between economic growth, competitiveness. We are all the time hearing about the Draghi's report about how EU has to be competitive, but not only in the sense of the economic growth and resilience, but also of the technological disruption and everything. And yes, the role of the diplomatic network, I'm talking about our Slovenian diplomatic network, but of course also in the European arena, the European diplomatic network, in connecting these international and local communities, is, I think, crucial. We established lots of instruments, let's say, to strengthen these collaborations. One of these is the so-called Science Fund, that is an instrument through which diplomatic missions and consulates abroad will cooperate and are cooperating in promoting the achievements of Slovenian science and of partnerships, European partnerships and innovation and research excellences. And of course, this we are introducing as a model of the already operating other instruments to promote cultural, economic development, since the development cooperation is also one of the same aspects as the scientific collaborations. And of course, we are working also on strengthening the network of scientific advisors or the scientific attachés all around the world. We have now already, let's say, more than 60 embassies, and every year we are opening another one. I'm pointing out that, of course, as a young country, we are doing step by step. And in 2025, let's say, anno, the most important dimension of science diplomacy, it is, I think, it's a strategic bridge. It's connecting knowledge, innovation, foreign policy in this complex, as we said already, fractured world. And it's not just about promoting science abroad. I think that it's about using science to build trust between nations, to address shared global challenges. We all know which they are, to secure our place in the future-oriented alliances. I think one of the concrete example, for instance, is Slovenia, maybe Slovenia's recent accession as a full member to CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research. And I have to say that now in just 2 weeks, for instance, the Slovenian flag will be raised in front of the CERN agency in Geneva. We are very, very proud of that. And this is a historic milestone, I think, of our scientific community, and also, let's say, a success of long-term, diplomatic efforts in this era. And we all know which opportunities will this bring to our researchers, to universities, and of course to all the European innovation ecosystem, if we can see that. And we see the similar potential also in our membership, for instance, in the European Space Agency, that we become full member at the beginning of this year. So anno 2025, I have to admit, is quite a challenging anno for us. I mean, because of course now they will open new possibilities for us to be more involved in the international cooperation. Another milestone maybe was also our coordinated response to the COVID-19 pandemic, where scientific collaboration, I know, and diplomatic coordination between all the embassies around the world enabled effective sharing of information, data, and this is a marvelous example of how diplomacy and science work together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Natasha. A lot on your plate, if I understand it correctly. Yes, we have about a good 10 minutes for some more questions. We'll try to handle those. So around 2:10, we'll go to the audience. So sit tight. We haven't forgotten about you. We hope you are still with us and enjoying this panel discussion. But I said, Nicolas, I'll get back to you about the training programs that you have there, connecting science and diplomacy. Could you tell me a little bit more about those? Who are they for? How do you do it? What competencies do you try to develop?
Yes, so well, in our work, we meet a lot of young and early career researchers from around the world who, are really passionate about research, but also very interested to engage more with that multilateral UN space. They bring a lot of passion, but also they express a lot of needs to acquire, tools, competencies, better awareness on how to enter and how to navigate those sort of complex international spaces, which are different from national contexts. And so, in the past 3-4 years, we've started to offer a set of capacity building activities with different goals. One of them is to help researchers familiarize themselves with science policy interfaces at the multilateral level, to really develop confidence in engaging in that space, which again can be daunting. When you think about just one UN agency or process, it's usually a lot of different actors, accreditations, timelines that need to be navigated. And also really to provide networking opportunities in those training programs with Geneva diplomats, experts, and UN professionals. So in terms of audience, I would say our audience is mostly researchers, again, young early career researchers, but not only. We have also participants from non-academic sectors in universities, and I think that was one question in the Q&A. And these are very important actors, whether they work in international affairs, public affairs, science policy units. It's a very diverse framework in how different universities organize themselves to promote science diplomacy or international policy engagement, but they play a very important role and they find themselves in some of the trainings we do. We have people that consider themselves knowledge brokers. They're not anymore necessarily doing research, but they have strong research backgrounds, and they, for example, sometimes work in national science academies, think tanks. We have some UN staff members as well, journalists, NGO leaders and private sector. But so it's, it depends on the programs, but we tend to have a quite diverse range of people who, the common denominator is really the interest to learn more about how to navigate the interface at a very practical level. So just to give you one example, we organize every year a summer school on science policy interfaces for environmental action. And, we have different formats in those trainings. We have, for example, exchanges and discussions with professionals from the UN system to really have, an insider view in terms of what's needed in terms of knowledge, what are the constraints and opportunities to really get to know, who's on the other side of the science diplomacy interface. We try also to have, bring in experts, boundary organizations that already do a work of, interface between science and diplomacy. And, there are many researchers who themselves would rather provide evidence and data to think tanks and those intermediary organizations that are, professional in engaging and advocating for positions at the diplomatic level. So it's important for researchers to meet them. We also make sure that we also bring other researchers from universities who have developed, strong experience to engage at the diplomatic level. That's always interesting as a researcher yourself to, to see examples of how others have managed to articulate the academic imperatives with that sort of social engagement. So, there's a really sort of practical hands-on element to those trainings. In terms of competencies, we promote, we have sessions on stakeholder mapping and engagement. It's really important as a researcher to do that initial work of understanding, in my field or in climate change or any other field, who are the key diplomatic actors, what are the timelines, what are the entry points for science. Timing is a really key element when you want to engage at the diplomatic level. You might have the best evidence possible, but if it's not provided at the right time to the right people in a given negotiation, you're going to sort of miss the opportunity. But also, also about knowledge brokering and synthesis, how to organize science policy dialogues, which are different from academic colloquiums. And, reflections also on individual leadership, the role that those people want to play. Also, some of the participants we have might, not necessarily continue in academia, but might actually branch out and get into a sort of knowledge brokering role. So these are sort of the competencies that we try to push in that summer school, but we also do shorter sort of tailored workshops with universities. It was mentioned we had a 3-day visit of UCL researchers in Geneva to really again, create that awareness of, who are the key actors in Geneva. And I think the feedback we had from those participants was a sort of sense of what are the doors they can knock on. In 3 days, there's only so much you can do, but at least they met people from platforms and others in Geneva who can open doors and sort of help them get to the next stage of their policy engagement. We also contribute to the Science Diplomacy Week in Geneva and other trainings. But I think to conclude, again, one lesson that we see from this work is that of course those trainings are very important because they help researchers and others get a sense of what they're getting into in a way. It helps them have a more strategic approach in engaging at that diplomatic level. But the best learning is really by doing, and it's really actually trying to get into collaborations with UN organizations or other entities. Really getting to conferences is really the best, one of the best learning experiences that researchers can have, and creating opportunities for them to do that is very important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Nicolas. I'm going to jump to Sally, and also because what you said about there's a lot of competencies to be developed, a lot of work to be done. But I think Sally and Nicolas should talk to each other about COARA and assessment reform, because clearly there's a lot to be done also in how do we support and incentivize and reward academics who are willing to engage in this work. But Sally, actually my question for you was coming back to the geopolitical considerations, and what are some of the key considerations that universities take into account? I know that you just you've had a task force on Gaza with that has just come up with its recommendations. I don't know if I can call it recommendations, but what are some of the decision-making mechanisms that universities can employ in considering, whether to adopt certain university positions or not? Can you talk us through a little bit to that?
Yeah, I can. And I think it's difficult to answer sort of in general, right? Insofar as the key considerations will differ as the geopolitical events differ. But I think there are some things that I think it is useful for universities to consider. And a lot of that is about what they can and feel able to tolerate, I think, in terms of their institutional culture. And I do feel that institutions should, be able to tolerate and be comfortable with a lack of cohesiveness at points, right? That there will be a range of different opinions expressed. I also think they should be able to tolerate and comfortable with, very deep moral and ethical views being propounded, with some of the emotional stuff that goes with that. I do think those things that universities should not be scared of, but I do think what they should be scared of is if people sense a lack of trust, like if a lack of trust in terms of people's view that the institution is acting in good faith to good purpose. I think that is something that universities should be very, very concerned with. And therefore, in order to ensure that trust, I think, is an evidence when these sort of institutional positions are being come to. I think there are a range of things that need to happen. And some of these will sound very general and kind of like bromides, but I think they are important with respect to our experience at Trinity with the task force that you mentioned. So firstly, I think extensive and authentic and credible consultation is important. We all know when we're being consulted with inauthentically. I think we all had that vibe and that feeling. And I think it is really important that the consultation universities do when they're reaching these sorts of positions it is felt to be and is genuine and credible. At the same time, I think the work of any such body making these decisions needs to be intensive in the sense that it can't be massively protracted, because I think then people again start to get the feeling that you're just putting it, there's a wonderful Irish expression, putting it on the long finger, which means you're just going to be saying you're doing something, but nothing ever really pans out or turns up, right? So I think extensive consultation, intensive work, and also a very highly representative group of people being involved. I think, so one of the features of the Trinity Task Force was deep and significant consultation very, very significant representation on that task force by the student body and the staff body. So as you mentioned, Trinity's board has recently received the report from the task force, and the task force was set up not specifically to look at the situation in Gaza, but to look more broadly at a set of developing a set of ethical principles for academic and institutional links in situations in which there's armed conflict or violations of international law. So it was really set up to develop these principles, but obviously did make recommendations on the application of those principles to that situation in Gaza. And I think it is important to understand that, I think the feeling of that consultation felt genuine to people, and the recommendations are, as I said, have been accepted by board. The one thing I would note is that one of the things that the task force and Trinity particularly looked at was that relationship between individual academic freedom and institutional responsibility. And this comes up quite a lot, right? The sense of when is it appropriate or permissible for one of those sets of values to potentially impinge or impact on the other? When is it permissible, and in what conditions and to what degree can those things, I suppose, influence one another in terms of institutional responsibility and individual academic freedom? And I think it is important that when universities come to these positions to understand that, there are no absolutes here. Academic freedom individually, cannot be an absolute, because we all live in a polity of one sort or other. But I would say that those features that I've described were very important to us coming to I suppose, the set of conclusions that the institution has now come to.
Okay, thank you, Sally, that was a very packed answer. Lots of things.
I do talk quite fast.
I wish we had hours to discuss all of this, but unfortunately, it's already 2:10. If I may impose a little bit more on our time for the panel, because they have such valuable views. I just want to ask Natasha and Jan each a question, and please be short in your answer if you can. But Natasha, how, very practically, can universities be helpful to you in diplomacy units or foreign relation units like yours? How does that work? Can you give us something practical?
Yes, of course, absolutely. They can be, let's say, our key allies in the practice of the science diplomacy. First of all, they give us research that we need. For instance, now we are an institution is exploring all the possibilities of the Slovenian diaspora, all around the world. That is actually that doesn't have a network yet, or the networks are very, let's say, focused on continents, and it's doing all this network for us so that we can also then cooperate with them, in knowledge sharing, and of course in spreading all the information. Then of course in teaching and training the diplomats, because we already mentioned, this is something also new for us. We are just diplomats, not scientists, and that's why since this is expanding and it's a new word, not just a buzzword, it has to give us also the tools of artificial intelligence and everything else that can be for us very important. The dialogue platforms, because they are neutral places, as we already mentioned, for exchange between diplomacy, science, civil society, and also businesses. And of course, they can also be, they have a growing role also in policy co-creation. So that's why for us, it's essential. We have a, let's say, if I can tell you, we have 3 public universities, for instance, in Slovenia, and 6 private universities, which is a lot for a country of 2 million people. So, and 19 public research institutes, that are really growing. And of course, now, for instance, part of our science diplomacy work is that we are actually actively engaging with them and paying them visits together with our Minister of Foreign Affairs. For instance, she just visited the University of Maribor, that is the second largest in Slovenia, last week, together with the representation of companies and with other institutions. And the goal was, of course, to present concrete ways how we can support their work. because in Maribor, as you maybe know now, is a new hub for science, innovation, and diplomacy, because it's a European AI factory that is being built there, supported by the Euro HPC joint undertaking, co-funded also by the European Commission, which will also make, let's say, Maribor one of the hubs, and also with that Slovenia one of the hubs of the artificial intelligence. So this is one of the examples that we are doing. So we are paying the visits also to the universities, involving them, and collaborating in this.
Okay, all right. Sounds good. Again, you have a lot on your plate there, Natasha. Good work. Finally, before we go to the questions, and I hate to put this to you, Jan, could you please be very short in your answer? But I do want you to see what you answer to Europe as a powerhouse for science diplomacy. Can it be? What needs to be happen for Europe to take that role on?
Well, I think let's remind ourselves, first of all, that we have centuries of legacy in science diplomacy, but we just haven't called it like this in the past. And I could give you lots and lots of examples. Actually, we also have a legacy, to be honest, of science being misused by diplomacy, and diplomacy being misused by science, if you think of our colonial and fascist episodes in our history, which is also something to learn from. But I think what we really need to do is to kind of transform this position which we have as a global research and innovation powerhouse into geopolitical clout. And few people actually know, for instance, that 100 countries around the world have based their approval of COVID vaccines on scientific assessments of the European Medicines Agency. Few people know that actually all the early genome data of the SARS-CoV-2 virus came out of China using the glass fiber cables of the GEON network. Few people know that actually the 27 member states together have more science, technology, innovation counselors in embassies than China and the US combined. I mean, we have lots of actually resources and lots of potential, but actually we need to turn this actually into, synergies and then to be able actually to kind of set our mark in a way at a global stage, fully exploiting all this potential. So what needs to happen is actually, first of all, we need to build it bottom up. In a very inclusive manner, taking all the communities on board. We need to create the spaces where scientists and diplomats can meet and update each other, exchange opinions. We need to create the communities, and the Science Diplomacy Alliance is one of those examples. And of course, we need structures, and it's quite interesting to see that in the meantime, 20 member states have created science diplomacy units or appointed chief science advisors in their ministries of foreign affairs. And Natasha is, of course, a testimony to this. So I think governments around Europe and at European level, we are really waking up and creating these structures now to be working together. But let's also be very clear, what we've done up to now is we are discussing a framework for science diplomacy. We are not yet discussing a strategy for science diplomacy. So we are creating the basics. We bring everybody up to speed. But the next step to happen is to turn this into a strategy, and I will make your life easier, Katrin, by already taking 2 questions from the chat. There was the one on how can we use science diplomacy to ease geopolitical tensions, and what to do when we have geopolitical rivalries like between the US and China. And of course, I mean, we need to be realistic. I mean, we can't do miracles of science diplomacy, but we can help in making the world a better place through talking to each other, through creating the basis for these discussions. And I always say at the moment, everybody around the world is discussing science diplomacy. And that's actually the right moment to do science diplomacy by discussing it.
Excellent. Great. And thank you for answering the questions already. What I'll do is I'll pick up some of the questions, about 5 from the chat, and put these to you. But I would also encourage you, while I do that, my panel, please look at the questions if you can. And if you feel particularly drawn to one question or the other, please speak up to that. But just so that we all know about what some of the things are that we want to talk about. I do want to call this question question out because it says universities are risk averse. Okay. Meaning they are stopping research and collaborations with many countries and in many areas based on political issues, sometimes going beyond what is legally required. Should they be pushing back more on this, arguing for more collaboration in certain areas? And what can diplomats do to help? James Hammond, thanks for that question. We have partially answered, I think, the one about non-academic university staff, but Sally, if you feel like you want to come back to that, or JC, feel free. The rival powers, okay.
I'm happy to jump in really quickly on that question that you mentioned. I think it's an interesting framework. You know, should they be pushing back? And my question would be against whom, right? I mean, the pressure. You know, both of these views are expressed within a single institution, and really, you know, it is not a question of universities. In my experience, at least, having this imposed on them from anybody, you know, would be pushing back against us ourselves, right? And so, to me, this becomes a really interesting and important question about you know, universities' values and how do we determine to what degree they align with you know, national values and geopolitical events. So this idea of pushing back, I think it's an interesting framing, but not necessarily one that's reflective of the reality of universities, which is these forces exist within the institution.
Okay, JC, you want to react to this, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I know where James is coming from, and I think it pertains also to the different levels that also I pointed out at universities and that Sally just alluded to in terms of the ways that university leadership potentially interpret, you know, what states are doing in terms of sanctions or security restrictions and so on. Sometimes it's hard law, sometimes it's soft law. There's a lot of just guidelines out there that universities have to navigate and don't necessarily know exactly what to do with. And so that then uncertainty trickles down also to researchers at the individual levels or units who want to engage in science diplomacy and potentially in intersections or difficult relationships, right? And I'm sure we're about to see a lot more with, you know, issues of course, Russia, China, even the US, right? And other places where single researchers may now hesitate or may not know exactly what to do. So I think it just to sum up, I think what Jan was saying is that it's important that all these levels talk to each other and talk to their states and talk to the EU, right, in terms of understanding exactly what to do, because otherwise it's counterproductive.
If I may come in on this, I think, of course, it's important to respect scientific autonomy and the independence of scientific institutions and what they're doing. In the same way, we need to respect, of course, the sovereignty of member states in foreign and security policies. But what I see quite often about is now this kind of shooting out of the hip because of we are being flooded via social media with the scandal of the day or the scandals of the day. And I think we need indeed a much better coordination between the science and diplomacy spheres.
Good. Okay, I see some other questions that pertain also to the how. How do universities, how do you start from zero? I hope that we have given some answers to this, but if you have any more examples of how universities have embraced the role of science diplomacy and how you organize it or integrate it into the system, that would be very, yeah, I think welcome by our audience. And another one is, and JC, you'll recognize this one from Luc van Langenhove. Thank you, Luc, for being here. Is the tension between cooperation and competition in science. This is important, says Luc, but is the most troublesome development not the rise of anti-science and the loss of academic freedom? And is there a role for science diplomacy there?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I mean, I can take briefly the training aspect, and I know where John comes from. There's no silver bullet answer here, but it's really trying to see what needs there are in terms of training within the nation state in which the university is, for example, or other entities which are, you know, near the universities or within the purview of the university. I think importantly is to try to bring it's very interdisciplinary, right, in nature, and I think we heard Nicolas talk about this. So it's really trying to build the units or the collaborations within the university that enables this kind of training to happen. I think in terms of the building of the connections, I think some universities are privileged in the sense that they're maybe in the capital or in Geneva even, right? So at the contact of various ministries or various entities. So sometimes it's easier for certain universities to engage, but that's where university alliances can come in and help with training and research and that promotion of international engagement. Just very briefly on questions from Luc, absolutely agree. I think universities need to be advocates for science in a way. It's their own public diplomacy. I mean, states do public diplomacy, promoting their values, promoting what they bring to society, what they do, and I think universities may have to do a little bit more of that towards society and towards international actors. That seems to be needed in this day and age now, even with the anti-science and academic freedom discourse that we see popping up all over the place.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Nicolas, I'll give you the floor in a minute. I just want to raise for everybody another issue that has come up in the questions. I think we have 2 minutes. I hope Kurt will forgive me that I impinge on his final words, but we've been navel gazing. We are LERU, we are in a specific part of Europe and we represent certain universities, and there is the West, there is the rest, as somebody calls it. There is also the rest of the world, Europe perhaps waning, other continents coming up. Jan Marco, there's a question on you also for Africa. Think about this while I give Nicolas the floor for giving a comment.
Yes, thank you very briefly. So my response would be more to the question on starting from zero on science diplomacy. And I think that, there's definitely not one recipe, but I would argue that you're likely not starting from zero, actually. So in Switzerland, we've seen several universities sort of ramp up, their capacities to engage at the diplomatic level. But I think, as a start, you might actually have researchers in your university who have engaged at the international level. So, as a first step, trying to sort of map out, who are those researchers? What have they done? What type of collaborations do they have with potential UN entities or other international actors can be a good first step. But, we know that mapping that is always a heavy endeavor in any university. You could start with some incentives like calls for projects, seed funding in your university to encourage and support projects that involve a collaboration with an international actor. Which, by the way, can be a good way to also see who is interested in your university to do that. Another idea is to, you might have still central public policy department or international affairs department. Try to do a visit in Geneva, maybe to a UN organization that relates to a field that's maybe strong in your university, health, economics, or in any other field. And it's, I think always welcome by UN secretariats to meet new academic actors. And lastly, you may join forces with other universities, alliances, networks around trainings. That can be easier than doing it yourselves. But I think that, in Europe, there are a lot of actors who can be there and be a sort of, also learn from other universities that have gone through that process.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to have to shut us down. Unfortunately, it's 2:28, and there are the questions keep pouring in at this point. If the panel has any final thought, you have about 10 seconds to make it. Otherwise, I go back to Kurt. I will also see if we can collect all those questions, share them with the panel. There may be ways of us getting back to those questions, answering some of those either individually or in another way, because I think there's been some really worthwhile questions that we can look at. And I see people nodding, so I hope that we can kind of follow up on that. I will certainly try. So So, nobody's jumping in. Kurt, it's back to you.
Thank you very much, Katrien, and thanks all for such a wonderful exchange of ideas and visions on the issues that we have been tackling this afternoon, all panel members, Jean-Christophe. So thank you very much for all of that. I think that the conclusion is quite easy after this 1.5 hours, namely that it is all about bridge building. As Natasha said, as others have been saying here this afternoon, making sure that in the following months, years, we can improve this bridge building between people, between institutions. Efforts will have to be made on the sides of all the involved partners, all the involved actors, national authorities. If everybody can follow the example of Slovenia by building out this network of science advisors and all the foreign office that they have, all their embassies. If I look at what Gianmarco said, this is just a framework, but we are heading to the strategy. And obviously there also we will be building on bridges between actors. What Nicolas said about everything that's happening in Geneva and the Geneva Science Policy Interface, it's clear that certainly on the government side, actions are in full development, are in full swing. I think that we as universities also have to take our responsibility. They have to increase our efforts as well in the field of education. We already got very nice examples in the field of research, in the field of societal service. I think that the message is clear there that we have to step up. What was perhaps only coming at the end of the debate, Gianmarco referred very nicely to national sovereignty. Sally referred nicely to academic freedom. It's clear that, of course, those two elements certainly play also a very important role in the debate that we will have in the future. Just one detail, perhaps, when Russia invaded Ukraine, obviously the European Commission decided in that case already itself, we stop all cooperation, and as a consequence, universities followed suit. In the case of Israel, Gaza, of course, there is no decision like that, which makes it a very difficult and different situation. Obviously, in the case of the US at this point in time, it's a very different setting there. But I think that we also have to make use of Choose Europe for Science to even boost further all the efforts which are developed on the issue of science diplomacy. So with these words, I would like to thank all of you again, Jean-Christophe, the panel members, all the participants for the questions. As Katrien said, we will try to follow up on the questions to the different people who have not received an answer orally here, but we will try to do our best to come up with a reaction for that. So for now, thank you very much. Hope to see you soon at another LERU event, but that certainly will be after the summer break. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.